You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're joined by Dr. Robert Melillo, a leading expert in childhood neurological disorders. With over 30 years of experience, Dr. Melillo will discuss his innovative approach, the Melillo Method, and how neuroplasticity can help transform the lives of children with ADHD, autism, and other learning disorders. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Robert Melillo.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, you're going to be probably talking well above my pay grade on this podcast today because neurology is something that I think a lot of us maybe don't completely understand the effects of that and on development itself. But before we go down that route, I'd love to hear where your interest sparked from. Oftentimes is that these passions come from somewhere and what they're driving our fields right now. So tell me a little bit about how you came into the field of neurology and autism specifically.
Yeah, so I went into the healthcare field because I was an athlete, and I had a lot of injuries, and I was interested in biology and learning more. And then when I was in graduate school, I had really great neuroanatomy and neuroscience courses that really sparked my interest in neurology. And my interest was always to try to combine those two together, to look at some sort of neurology and rehabilitation. And that's kind of fueled me so that when I got out, I focused on, getting a diplomate in neurology and in rehabilitation. And then I went into clinical rehabilitation neuropsychology and then did a PhD in cognitive neuroscience to kind of bring it all together. And, during that time, obviously being a clinician working in that field, but, I was teaching clinical anatomy in the early 90s and starting to have an interest in brain research because the 90s, Bill Clinton had declared it the decade of the brain. So all of this new brain research was coming out and also new ways of looking at the brain, like MRI and functional MRI and PET scans and SPECT scans and more advanced EEG, QEEG, and electromagnetocephalography. So we were able to look at the brain in real time, which had never been able to do before. And we started learning more about functions in the brain, and a lot turned to the idea of functional connectivity, that problems were not due to damage or injury or lesions in the brain. And the idea of chemical imbalances was kind of like not really seeming to line up as much. But the idea that there was a problem with functional communication in the brain without damage to the brain and without genetic mutations, but that breakdown in communication was at the root cause of most, if not all, mental health and learning disabilities and developmental issues. How it got that way wasn't clear, but it was clear that obviously something was going on during development that was affecting that. So this was an area I was really interested in. But then in 1995, two things happened. One, came home one night and there was a woman sitting crying at my kitchen table with my wife, and her son had ADHD and was really struggling, and they, had some real aggression in the house, and she had tried everything and she was really frustrated. And she wanted to know, if more could be done. My wife asked me to help her. And then I went to my oldest son's first parent-teacher meeting. And the teacher says to me, I think your son has ADHD. Now, I didn't know a lot about ADHD or childhood disorders at the time because I was focused more on adolescents and adults. But it really hit me. My first question was, what is ADHD? Like, what is actually happening in the brain? Because I knew a lot about the brain at that point, as much as, I could at that point. And, for me, as a rehab mentality, I was like, okay, well, what can I do to try to change that, to try to rehabilitate it? And I needed to know what it was. And I went to colleagues of mine that I hope would know an answer, like neuropsychologists or pediatricians or pediatric neurologists. And they all basically looked at me and said, I don't know what the actual problem is. Might have something to do with dopamine or the frontal lobe, but don't really know. Why do you want to know? And I said, well, my son just got, labeled with this, and I want to see if I can help him. And they said, well, other than medication, there's really nothing you can do about it. And I said, wait, you just told me you don't know what it is, but you're absolutely sure I can't do anything about it. So how does that work? And I realized that, okay, I needed to really kind of jump in and do this myself, which I kind of became obsessed with it, finding the answer. And after 10 years of research, I published a textbook called Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood, an Evolutionary Perspective, which was a 500-page PhD level textbook that was published by Kluwer, which was the #1 publisher in the world of neuropsychology. And during that way, I was looking to develop ways of being able to help my own child. And not only my own child, I ended up starting to help other kids. And so that kind of was the foundation of my work over the past 30 years.
And every time I talk with somebody that's within this field, especially when you're talking about being able to service those with specific needs, is that there's always a passion behind it. And that's obviously where yours stem from as well, is that you said you just couldn't let it go. Like, you had to figure it out. Is why are we turning to psychopharmaceutical treatment for things that we don't even know the root cause for? But one thing that hit me is that when you were talking through that, is that you were an athlete. When you're talking about rehab, when you're talking about muscle development, when you're talking about everything that goes on with the body, it is that we need to really focus on what we're targeting, what muscles we're building, what repeatability, so that we can create new movement, new structures. Is that similar to what you were finding through your research with the brain?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, the interest in this, as you go along the road, when you're on a purpose, you get little messages from the universe that tell you you're on the right way, right? So early on, I didn't, first of all, I didn't know, because I'd also, right after that, I was driving to work, and on the radio, there was a statistic that came out that said the use of Ritalin in the United States for ADHD from 1990 to 95 had gone up 250%, and no one knew why, right? So this was all hitting me, and my first instinct was, well, maybe this is just being overdiagnosed, right? Maybe it's not a real problem, or maybe it's not increasing. So I spoke to a teacher that I was treating, and she had been a teacher for like 30 years in elementary school. And I said to her, this ADHD thing, is it like really increasing? And she looked at me and said, you have no idea. She's like 50% of the kids at lunchtime, because at that point, if a kid got a pill, it was given to them at lunchtime by the nurse. So she said 50% of kids are lining up to get their pill. And I was like, 50%? She said, you have no idea. And she told me to read a book called Endangered Minds by an educator named Jane Healy. And she confirmed that this was a real increase, that we were seeing actual differences, that kids' brains were different. And I was like, And so I said to this woman, the teacher, I said, why do you think this is? And she looked at me, she said, I don't know the answer, but it has something to do with kids don't use their big muscles anymore. She said, you drive around, you don't see kids in the street, you don't see kids in the playground playing like they used to. And she goes, I don't know what it is, maybe you can figure it out, but there's some relationship. So now I was like, oh, wait, she's saying there's a correlation between something to do with movement and brain development. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. That's something that kind of fits into my wheelhouse. And now I was really piqued. And when I was writing my first textbook, again, the reason why it's entitled From an Evolutionary Perspective, I went back to say, all right, well, where do brains come from? Like, what was the first brain that developed, and why did it develop? And it turns out that it develops because of movement. That, some of the top researchers in evolutionary medicine and neuroscience had really detailed that, animals or living things that don't move don't have brains. And as soon as a thing started to move, it required a brain to make a prediction and to build a sensory motor model and to make a choice of, do I go this way or that way? So brains developed on this planet because of movement. And then later on, it became realized that, Also, brains develop in childhood because of movement. And anything that interferes with movement or alters normal development of movement has a major impact or the major impact on brain development because it also drives the sensory system. So that's where that kind of overlap came from.
I mean, and just thinking through it logically, that all makes sense. And I mean, even when you're looking at the amount of inputs that are coming to children on a regular basis where they're not having to physically engage, is that there's so much just coming in the form of media, in the form of just different sorts of constant gratification input where, you don't have to physically engage. You don't have to move. You don't have to be a part of that environment around you. So when you're talking about ADHD and autism, they seem like, there's some overlap in some of the common traits that you might see, but then there's a lot of differences. So you're treating two very different disorders in a way that you're kind of taking those core concepts and applying it to both. So what is the difference of what you're looking at between those two conditions, and how are you deviating between those?
Well, that's where the way I look at things is I always look at it from a neuroanatomy and neuroscience perspective, meaning that when we say ADHD, a lot of people may fit an ADHD label, but they can look very different, some of them even opposite of one another, but we kind of tend to all group them into ADHD, even though we know there are subtypes, right? So there's ADHD type 1, type 2, type 3. And if you look at those subtypes, they can be very different neurologically and even the opposite. So the first thing I say is we have to define what we mean by ADHD and what we mean by autism. And even on the autism spectrum, there's a wide variety. You can go from people that are incredibly verbal and very high functioning to those that are completely non-speaking. And those are different subtypes, right? So from a neurological perspective, and I published a number of papers on the neuroanatomy of both of these, very detailed. The classic model of ADHD, type 3, the combined type with impulsivity and hyperactivity and inattentiveness, is clearly more of a right brain delay, right? There are networks on the right side of the brain in the right frontal lobe that are underdeveloped. The orbital frontal cortex that has to do with socialization, awareness, the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, attention in general is more of a right brain function. We know out of 5 different types of human attention, the right brain governs 4 of them, right? So, the classic model in neuroscience, if you really look at the neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, is more of a left hemisphere, more advanced development and overactivity, where many of these people are very gifted academically. They have a really good memory for details. They may be more logical and linear, and they have a right brain delay where they may, lack a little social inhibition ability, some of the ability, the ability to stop movement. There's an area of the brain, the left side of the brain called Brodmann area 6, which is the supplemental motor area. When that's overactive, that causes physical hyperactivity, tics, stimming behavior, and the right side on that same side inhibits it. It's called the hyperdirect pathway in the basal ganglia. So there are these, clear things, but we get type 1 ADHD, and that is more often associated with people with a left brain deficit that may also struggle in school, but may be very creative or gifted socially, or maybe, overly aware and, overly friendly. And so from an observation standpoint, they might look similar. You might say, well, that kid who's really over creative and over social, and is spatial and wants to move their body and gets very bored easily and is struggling in school maybe with, reading and some basic things, they may look distractible or hyperactive. But it's very different than a kid that literally has, there are literally different areas of the brain that are out of balance there. But yet they're all grouped as ADHD, but neurologically, they're complete opposites. So that's one thing I talk about. Now, when we look at autism, again, autism spectrum is also a very severe right brain delay. But again, the level of that delay and the level of advanced left brain skills really can set the tone as to whether this is a child that's very verbal and articulate, but has no sense. I just had a mom sitting in front of me and she said, my son he'll have a conversation straight for an hour, but have no idea if the person's even listening to them or care about whether they are interested in, if he has no interest in their input or what's happening in their life. It's a one-sided conversation, but he's incredibly bright and articulate, but he has this severe social deficit and he has OCD and he has some tics. So there's a similar model there that the overall has to do with this balance of different networks and the development of that. And so that's where I look at it. I look at what areas of the brain are different. And in each kid, it's slightly different, but there are patterns of areas on the right brain are delayed and other areas are advanced. And that's where the overactivity on one side and underdevelopment, and we can mix them up. And you could explain OCD, Tourette's, ADHD, type 3, type 2. So that's the way I look at it from a neuroanatomy perspective. And that's because now we're going to use that to specifically target those areas of the brain to create balance.
The picture that you just drew gave a pretty inclusive view of the fact that we all probably have these imbalances, and it's to the exaggerated levels that maybe it causes barriers to being able to engage in the world in the way that you want to. And to be empowered to be able to be successful in every walk of life that you're hoping for. So when you're describing this, I'm thinking about, the behavioral health world and the overlap between understanding some of these concepts and being able to apply them effectively. What is the Melillo Method? And I mean, obviously, you're not just saying, well, this child is autism. This is what they do. It's almost like you tailor everything very individualized to how that individual's brain and where their, hemispheric imbalance is causing challenges. Yes. But what is that Melillo Method?
Yeah, so it's a system of assessing someone first and foremost to try to identify, their strengths, their weaknesses, what areas of the brain. I have checklists that different questions are targeted towards assessing different areas of the brain that relate to different functions. And, the thing about the human brain is that it is the most asymmetric brain, and that is a great advantage. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist. He's a well-known psychiatrist out of the UK that's written a number of books in the same vein as my books on looking at brain asymmetry as really that's the explanation. He has a quote from a neuroscientist named Tim Brown who says, nothing in psychology or psychiatry makes sense unless you look at it in light of brain asymmetry, right? When you look at these areas of the brain and areas that may be overactive and underactive, now it explains all of these different things that we put into labels of schizophrenia or bipolar or depersonalization or derealization, or what does that mean, right? I mean, they relate to specific areas. So like, for instance, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the right side does what's called reality testing, meaning it's constantly telling us this is real, this isn't real. The left side of the brain is really creating more of a virtual model of the world at all times and looking at abstractions. If you have a deficit on that right side, you may not be able to judge reality accurately, and you might be over in a world of a virtual world. And too much of that is psychosis. That's what psychosis is, right? So that's the way I like to define things. Now, some people out there who I don't really think know the brain very well think that might be overly simplistic. And of course, it's more complicated than that, right? But we also understand there's a bottom-up development of the brain, top-down, so what we call vertical integration, and there's also horizontal integration. That's how the brain develops. The brain develops in very specific stages, and it first starts with movement. And movement starts in us with something called primitive reflexes. So one of my main areas of research is looking at, again, how that programmed early movement, if that goes awry in some way or doesn't go away when it's supposed to, that alters the development of the brain. And the right side of the brain is developing first in the first 3 years, and then the left brain takes the lead for the next 3 years, and this sets the basis. So there's a bottom up, top down, starting physically, but then that drives sensory stimulation, sound, light. And so that feeds the brain. And there's a literal physical growth to the brain. And that growth to the brain needs to match the signals that are coming from the outside for them to connect. Like in the attachment world, we look at it and say, okay, well, attachment is developed by the parents interacting with the child and giving them the right cues and facial expression, and that builds their right brain. Alan Shore out of UCLA has done great writings on this. And that develops it. And so therefore, if the parent isn't giving the right signals, that child may not develop that. But I look at it differently and I say the parent's giving the right signals, the child's brain isn't developed enough to be able to receive those signals at that time. So this kind of asynchrony of the messages from the environment coming in, and where the brain normally would be able to respond, but now is too young, too immature, and too underdeveloped. So our basic principle is we want to get the brain to grow. We want to get it to mature by stimulating it. We use physical exercises and then sensory stimulation as our bottom up. And then we're targeting specific areas where certain areas we want to grow them, other areas we want to slow down and quiet down. And then we want to add different types of cognitive skills on top of that as they're advancing. And then we're supporting all of this with diet and nutrition, because the brain is the ultimate regulator of the autonomic system, the gut, and the immune system. So many of these kids have, vitamin and mineral deficiencies and food sensitivities, and all of that starts in the brain.
And I mean, to go full circle to this, I mean, to go back to the idea of just the athlete, I'm thinking of the athlete's body as a brain, just for the time being. The athlete is realizing where it is that what muscles need to be built more. They're focusing more time and energy. They're rehabbing parts of their body that are not performing at the level they need to get balance. No athlete wants to be imbalanced in the way that they're working. They want to be able to kind of function as a complete unit. Right. It sounds like the way that you're describing the brain, it's in the same way, but I guess the question always comes into play is, the level of neuroplasticity in the brain. Is it something that, can be remediated over time and done so in an effective way? Or does it take a lot of practice, a lot of input in and out of some of the training sessions that you might be providing? Does it take constant practice throughout the day just to be able to kind of build up on this?
Yeah, no, you're really astute that you picked up on this. I do use this analogy. Again, the first concept is that people don't think of that the brain needs to physically grow, right? And we think about, okay, well, we want to learn things and we want to stimulate our brain, or we're doing things, and we just kind of take it for granted that the brain's going to grow the way the brain's going to grow. But that's not true, right? The brain can be stopped or altered, sped up or slowed down in its literal physical growth. And again, there are different areas of the brain, like different muscles, that do different jobs. The brain does things. It moves things, it feels things, it generates thoughts, it generates attention. And all of those are different areas of the brain and do it differently. And we need to have them sometimes work simultaneously, and sometimes one takes the lead and it inhibits the other side. But these physical activities, everything we do with our brain, our emotions, are specific networks in the brain. And each individual emotion has a different network. And if that network fires off because it's too strong, because something on the other side isn't inhibiting it, we feel an emotion, and then we look and we say, well, why am I feeling that emotion? It must be something bad happened to me, or somebody did something to me, or when it really isn't. It's just that fired off and it made you feel something. We don't tend to think that way, but it's a much more practical way. And like you said, your analogy, if I injure my leg and my knee, I'm going to have an imbalance in my quadricep and my hamstrings, and I need to restore that. But working on my bicep isn't going to change my quadricep, right? And I have to do very specific things. And if I do my quadricep on the right, but I've injured my quadricep on the left, that isn't really going to do anything, right? So, and it depends on, am I training it for endurance or do I want to build up explosive strength? So there are very different functions in each area of our brain, and we need to do very specific things. There's an underlying health of the brain, just like there's an underlying health to our body. All of our muscles are dependent on our nutrition and on our oxygen and on our body and how healthy we are and how mature our body is. So it's a similar analogy of that. And we're trying to really be very targeted. And I think this is where the future of this is going to have to go.
No, absolutely. I mean, when you think about, sometimes when there's a physical observation of an injury, we'll talk about maybe strokes. Is that with a stroke survivor, is that oftentimes you're looking at, okay, I'm going to start using movement, I'm going to start engaging them, and then language will start redeveloping. Help me to kind of understand, without a physical injury like a stroke, with communication with somebody who maybe didn't develop vocal or even physical communicative methods, how can they start to learn that through getting some, I guess, some more balance within the way that their brain is functioning?
Sure. Well, almost all skills in the brain are emergent properties, meaning they emerge as that area of the brain grows. And again, there's this bottom-up growth process that occurs. So all of the things that end up in the brain really start in the brainstem and are led up there. So vision comes in first through the brainstem, and sound comes up in through the brainstem, and it goes into an area called the thalamus, and then it's transferred into the temporal lobe or the occipital lobe, and that area of the brain then becomes the visual cortex, and the auditory becomes and if we switch those fibers, they will be the opposite, right? So they're emergent properties. So there's what makes the brain grow on the most baseline level. And the baseline is that it needs to move. It needs to have sensory stimulation. If we deprived children of the proper sensory stimulation or movement, there was a study years ago that looked at children that were raised in Romania. At the time, they had all these orphan children, especially AIDS children. And they were these huge rooms with, hundreds of baby, cribs. And these children were in it. They didn't have enough people to support them. And they ended up, a lot of these children had severe delays. And many Americans saw that and said, oh, I want to adopt a baby from there. And they did. Many of these kids came back and they had serious mental issues and delays. And so the fact that they weren't allowed to move and that they may have been not touched or not, got the right signals emotionally, and they weren't, maybe being fed properly, had an impact on delaying their brain and creating these different types of imbalances that led to different types of disorders. So, the idea that we have to first look at how the brain is literally built, and then how we target specific skills and what their exposure is, psychologically. I mean, is a child traumatized? Are they not exposed? I mean, if you took a child who was never exposed to a book, even though their brain may grow completely normally, they couldn't read. But if the area of the brain that reads doesn't develop physically, they can be exposed to all the books in the world and they won't read and they'll be dyslexic. So it's both things need to be. You need bottom up and top down to come together at the right time. And so we're aware of that, do they have this exposure? Do they have this experience that we're giving to them at the right time? But like in dyslexia, we know that, if a child can't read words, which is the definition of dyslexia, making them read more doesn't change it. But if you do physical activities and exercises and you stimulate the left side of the brain, then they are able to read later on at a normal level. So whether the area of the brain is delayed or whether it's damaged or whether they never experience that skill, it can all look the same. The only thing is that when it's damaged, we may not be able to do anything to change it, but those other things we can change.
Knowing everything that you just described there, and just the empowerment of understanding what areas of the brain might be imbalanced and how to be able to provide additional support and focus, it immediately, from clinician to clinician, it makes me think that this type of treatment that you're describing through the Melillo method is ideal for multidisciplinary work. Is that when you're looking at most autism treatment, it's behaviorally focused. It's applied behavior analysis is one of the big components that is the natural integration of some of the behavioral skills. But with the knowledge that you're providing, it almost allows for even more tailored supports, more practice effect, more ideal provision of any sort of care that's going on outside, so that you're able to make sure that the child's developing in the way that you want, and that the brain development is more targeted and more focused. The way that you see the Melillo method, do you see it as a all-encompassing multidisciplinary approach where you have, like you said, the nutrition, where you have maybe occupational therapy, physical therapy, the understanding of the brain, and then the behavioral application of all these skills in real life environments? Do you see this as a broad approach to treatment?
Yeah, I mean, that's what it was from the beginning. So when you ask about, the Melillo method, some of the principles I think that are somewhat unique, or the combination is unique, is again that, understanding the idea of this bottom up, top down, horizontal integration piece, that the relationship between brain development and growth of the brain. But I think that also I realized early on that we're dealing with multiple areas and multiple networks, because you have multiple symptoms and you have multiple strengths and weaknesses. So that I realized early on that it wasn't about just addressing one area of the brain or one problem, which is the way most therapies are designed, right? Someone does just, music therapy, or someone does just vision therapy, or someone just does nutrition, or someone does just behavioral intervention, or someone does just educational intervention. And even though they're all good, I felt like we needed to do all of that at the same time, because that's how the brain works. It's about what we call same time integration. It's about getting all of these areas of the brain to integrate, which I said goes back to the concept of functional connectivity. And, when you look at that, these kids all have multiple areas, and then understanding that we're going to tailor it, and then understanding that the brain is the ultimate controller of the autonomic system and of the immune system, so that anything that's going on biomedically. In 2009, we wrote a paper that some researchers and editors called, the first universal theory of autism, where we explained that these developmental imbalances in networks between the right side and the left side, and the imbalance that results in with a sympathetic nervous system dominance and a deficit of the parasympathetic nervous system, could explain everything that was documented in the biomedical world in autism. And so we brought together that, biomedical body piece, gut, all of that with the brain cognitive, with the motor, the sensory. And so, what we do is, what called co-activation, where we're doing all of these things at the same time, where we have someone in our office or at home, because as you said also, a lot of this is about reps. To get neuroplasticity, it's about doing things repetitiously. So we do have people do things at home. They all have home programs, and we give them instruction and we teach them how to do that. And we play a lot of work into education. So there's a psychology piece to it. So it's really, I think, yes, the model of what I think we need to grow into for brain health as a whole. If we really want to talk about what brain health is, which, by the way, is the #1 Google search term for health around the world right now, is brain health. I think this is the most complete model of that moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is getting all of the practitioners to be able to kind of work together in unison, similar to how you want the brain to work right now. We need all these pieces to be able to work at the same time. What suggestions do you have for parents that are seeking treatments for neurological disorders or who are looking to be able to? It sounds like almost all parents could benefit from understanding their child's brain development and helping to provide the inputs. But what suggestions do you have for them as they start to kind of work through different options?
Yeah, I think we would all benefit from having basically an instruction manual for our brain when we're born, right? I mean, no one gives us that. And the fact is that of all of our organs, the least that most people know about is their own brain. And it's obviously the most important. And again, this is a thinking process that's where I want people to say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I should know more about my child's brain and what the actual, one of the first questions I ask parents when they come from all over the world is, I say to them, has anybody tried to describe to you what may be happening in your child's brain to produce these issues that you're here for? And they always look at me and go, no one's even attempted it. Even people, I have a guy here who's one of the top surgeons in New York City at one of the top hospitals in the world. And a couple of days ago, he was here with his 4-year-old child who's non-speaking. And I asked him, I said, do you explain to your patients what's happening and what you're going to do and what the problem is? He said, yeah, I go into great detail. I said, did anybody do that with you, with your son? And he said, no, not at all. So, and I think it's because a lot of people don't have that understanding. And it goes back to my very first question with my own child. What is happening in his brain? So I think as we learn more and as we do that, and as you said, one of the challenges, and we're in such a highly specialized medical system, and that works in some ways. But when we're talking about a system like the brain, which is what integrates everything and involves every system, you need to think not in a specialized way, but in a generalized way. And you need to get more doctors that know more about the whole body and the brain and its connection, rather than doctors that know about every little specialized area of the body. And so we need to train people how to think holistically. And really, you talk about holistic medicine. I mean, I think the ultimate holism is realizing that the brain actually is the connector to all aspect of holistic health. So I think, we can train people like that. I've been doing this around the world for almost 30 years. And I think people like it. And, I just think we need to get more, people like you raising awareness and bringing this out there in an intelligent way where we can start to look at things in a different way.
Yeah, I think humility plays a role in that as well. Is that professional humility is just understanding is that it's good to reach across disciplines and understand before you start giving advice, and to make sure that you, in all the areas that you're giving any sort of recommendation, that you're competent. So where can people turn to be able to learn more about your work or just other resources on this topic? Because, like you said, understanding of the brain is A, hard. B, it's not something that's oftentimes given directly to families.
Yeah. So, from a layperson perspective, obviously I have a number of books that I've written. Disconnected Kids is the most popular. That was my first lay book after my textbook and after some research papers. And the third edition just came out this past August. So it's really updated with a lot of the research that we've published over the last several years. And so, I'm really happy about that because we've been really coming out with a lot of, advances and changes rapidly, and it's now added in the book. So that's where the first source, I think, where they can really understand. And then, as the brain is changing, understanding what those changes look like is what my second book, Reconnected Kids, is about. My third book was about what causes this all and what can you do possibly preconception to lower the risk of having a child with a disability, and to look at, as an adult, how do you make your body more healthy to prepare for pregnancy, both for men and women, because equally issues. And then I have a diet and nutrition book that is really more geared towards understanding that these are actually initiated by the brain. So those are really good resources, as well as my website. On my Instagram, it's pretty popular. I have a lot of people, a lot of information there. But my wife and I also did a web series on what this looks like in the home. How do you bring? A lot of doctors never go into their patient's home, so they can tell them what to do, but are they doing it, and what does that look like? So my wife and I did a series that is on a network called Your Home TV. And it came out a little over a year ago, and it's been #1 on that network, and it's over 4 million views right now. So people can access that and they can see how to practically apply this. And then I also have a podcast called the Melillo Method Podcast, Everything Brain, on YouTube and Spotify and Apple, in which we really go through a lot of these things and dive into it like you and I are doing it. And so that's another resource where people can learn. And for professionals, I have a certification fellowship level course that's online. That's about 150 hours that they can take. And then I also have an advanced functional neuroanatomy course that is about 5 modules that they can take to really understand the neuroanatomy from a functional perspective and how that relates.
Yeah, I mean, knowledge is power, and as much as like small deviations in some of the imbalance creates wonderful neurodiversity, a lot of different ways of people interacting in the world. But when there are barriers that are being caused by this, it's nice to feel empowered to know that I can go and start working through some of these barriers. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. And I hope that folks are able to listen to this. And I actually really hope that clinicians have the open mind to realize that, let's take some of the knowledge that we have from so many different disciplines, work together to create wonderful treatment models. But thank you so much, Dr. Melillo, for coming in today and sharing your experience and your knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. And there's 2 things I think. One is both what you just said. One is, I always tell parents and patients that, there is this incredible neurodiversity around us, and it's great. And all of our brains are different. And, when we're gifted or uniquely talented in an area, it's because some area of our brain is just naturally stronger. But when you're more gifted in an area, you're also more vulnerable for a deficit in another area. So that anybody that I work with, and especially in the autism spectrum, they're geniuses with their left brain, every single one of them. But many of them can't actually show it. And they're trapped in this body that they can't feel and they can't control, but their intellect is there. And it's incredibly frustrating. But, to understand that these children are gifted, and we want to just be able to help them become the best version. We're not trying to change them or say there's anything wrong with who they are. We're just trying to get them to become the best version of them. Mm-hmm. And embrace neurodiversity, but also realize that we all can change and we all can improve. And all of us can do that. And, people that are struggling, if we can minimize their struggles, then we're doing something valuable, right? And I think that's an important perspective. But also that, for doctors and professionals, that understand that, just because you learned it in school doesn't mean there may not be a better point of view or new information, or, just because something is accepted doesn't mean it's, right. And just because something isn't accepted by everything doesn't mean it's wrong. And be open to that and judge it yourself. But, that's why I get some people that, that go to my website and professionals and researchers that say, well, this isn't true. They've never read one of my papers. They've never read any of my books. If you really want to dive into something, read about it and then make a judgment on it. Look into it. Don't just judge it on its surface, because I think you'd be missing out on really something that might really help your patients a lot. So just be open-minded and just be open to new information.
Well, wonderful advice. And thank you again for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.